1991. Terminator 2 Judgment Day was a certified summer blockbuster. The release of Nirvana's Nevermind ushered in the era of grunge and put the final nail in the coffin of hair metal, and come November, the 5-year wait for a follow-up to Nintendo's sci-fi adventure Metroid would finally come to an end with the release of a sequel for the Game Boy handheld. The Super NES had just been released in the West a couple of months prior, but it would be another 3 years before it would see its own entry in the Metroid series. But for now, let's take a trip down below the surface of SR388 and talk about Metroid 2 Return of Samus on this installment of Metrospective. The last time we saw Samus Aran, she was wandering aimlessly through the boxy hallways of planet Zebes, hunting down Kraid, Ridley, and Mother Brain, while pilfering the caves and ruins for gear upgrades that would aid her in her mission. After destroying the Mother Brain and making a daring escape from Turian, Samus left the planet Zebes and set out on adventures that we know nothing about. Not even remotely. Not a single thing is known about any of them. Anyway, after the Zebes incident, the Galactic Federation made a decision. The Metroids needed to be wiped out entirely and sent a crew down to SR388 to take care of them. But that crew turned up missing, as they always do, and the Federation soon realized that the only person for the job, again, was Samus Aran. So she was sent down to SR388's surface to destroy the Metroids until there were no more left on the planet. Whether the merits of genocide were debated, I don't know. It was 1991. Most video games weren't really up to the task of pondering just how bad it is to completely wipe out a race of creatures at the risk of galactic threat. And I know that I certainly wasn't talking about this because I was 5. So, Samus, back on her bullshit, heads down to the Metroid homeworld of SR388, and that's about where we come in. So when you fire up Metroid 2, you'll land on the star-speckled title screen and choose which file you want to begin. In the years since the release of Metroid, Nintendo had figured out the merit of battery-backed saving mechanisms in many of their games, so unlike its predecessor, Metroid 2's save system wasn't exclusive to Japan. When you press start, you're placed on the surface of SR388 next to Samus' spaceship. Unlike last time, you've already got the morph ball and some missiles ready to go, so if you set off to the left, you'll reach a dead end before returning to your ship, this time opting to head the other direction toward the cave opening ahead. From here, you traverse through a downward path until again you're faced with a choice of which way you want to go. To the right sends you only so far before you're met with a pit of acid, preventing you from progressing any further. Returning back to the fork in the road and heading down the left path sends you deeper down through the caves. Before long, you face off with a newly hatched Alpha Metroid that starts flying at you like an agitated insect. 5 quick missiles later, the Metroid is dead. Easy enough, right? Only 39 more to go. So exploring the room further yields more treasures, as you discover the first of several energy and missile refill stations that are placed across the planet. That's right, no more spending several minutes repeatedly clearing the same room of enemies to top off your energy or missiles. Just kidding, there's still a little bit of that, but already the game feels friendlier than its predecessor. So suddenly, an earthquake occurs with no visible effect in the room you're in. If you backtrack past the fork in the road and head toward the acid pit, you'll find that it has receded, allowing you further access into the increasingly claustrophobic caves and ruins of SR388. From here, the gameplay loop of Metroid 2 has been established. Enter an area, clear it of Metroids, the earthquake signals that the acid has dropped, and it's time to head further down into the planet. This repeats through, well, the rest of the game. Now, while Metroid 2 plays mostly similar to its predecessor, there were some big changes that were made. Samus can properly crouch now, as well as fire downward while falling. Of course, the visuals are quite different given the reduced screen space of the low-resolution Game Boy, as well as its limited color palette. But Return of Samus makes good use of what it has, and instead of pursuing a less detailed screen that kept a similar scale to its predecessor, the camera is zoomed in slightly on Samus, rendering her larger on screen, as well as making the environments you're navigating seem more claustrophobic. Like other games in the series would do, it flirts with horror without totally committing, but despite the overall low-tech approach, Metroid 2 comes the closest, making it somewhat of a series outlier. Unfortunately, in addition to the screen resolution, the soundtrack also took a bit of a hit. Metroid 2's music isn't exactly notable, outside of its main adventure theme. and most of the audio is there to create the low-resolution soundscape of SR388. Much of the music is a little jarring and not very tuneful, and the majority of the music I actually used for this video is pulled from Super Metroid or the NES game. Metroid 2 was only Ryoji Yoshitomi's third Game Boy sound project, and I just don't think the system was up to what he wanted to convey. In a bigger game, I'm sure there would be way more in the way of ambient pads and synths, and the 3DS remake goes for something that sounds more like the Metroid Prime games, so what do I know? Samus herself is more detailed than she had been previously, now with a distinct visual difference in her power suit once she acquires the Varia suit upgrade. Selecting your missiles appears to open a little hatch on your arm cannon, and even just her sprite in general, while rendered in black and white, has considerably more detail. In fact, a lot of the game's sprites are more detailed this time around. The creatures of the planet all look a bit more distinct, and the Metroids even have a fair bit of detail on them. The sprites have come a long way since the weird-looking Ridley blob from the NES game. Samus still moves about the same as she did on Zebes, but the physics seem slightly more dialed in here. Jumping from a neutral position will still propel you upward, and jumping at an angle will still put you into a somersault. The existing moveset with the new maneuverability added on makes you feel more in control of Samus while you're wandering around through the caves of SR388. And, in addition to the returning moveset, all of the power-up items from the previous game return. The Varia suit, Screw Attack, Ice Beam, Wave Beam, and High Jump Boots are out there waiting to be found, while Return of Samus adds several new ones that too would become fixtures in the series moving forward. New to Metroid 2 is the Space Jump, which allows for a continuous somersault through the air, helping you to navigate the larger environments with some level of ease. The Spring Ball allows Samus to jump in Morph Ball mode, while the Spider Ball enables the Morph Ball to stick to walls. With all of this in tandem, Samus is considerably more agile than she was previously, and it makes the game more fun to play, at least in some instances. So with the advent of these new items, the environment has changed a bit since the rigid columns and corridors of the NES game. Tight spaces will now open up into vast cavernous rooms. It all feels a bit more like a natural space versus the overall boxiness of Zebes. That in mind, there is a distinct difference between the two. While Metroid was designed around an open environment with a limited amount of item-locked progression, Metroid 2 is a decidedly more linear experience, and its item progression is often more rigid and actually required to proceed. An item found in one area could likely be required in some capacity to progress through the one that follows. Oftentimes, Metroid 2 will repeat the loop established in the first area, discover a path filled with acid, proceed in the other direction, eliminate the Metroids and collect items and gear, the acid will recede, and you can move forward and repeat the process all over again. Unless you happen to miss some items, there's little incentive to backtrack, relegating the inclusion of Samus's spaceship as a potential navigation landmark to little more than a visual storytelling flourish. Samus's journey takes her further and further into the darker depths of SR388 as wildlife gradually becomes less common and the Metroids themselves become more dangerous. Starting off, there's just the basic Alpha Metroids, which fly at you like an irritated insect. The larger Gamma Metroids do the same, but with the addition of a melee swipe. By the time you start finding Zeta Metroids, they have developed bodies that are a little harder to find the hitbox on, and they'll take a few more missiles to defeat. As you inch closer toward the end of the game, you'll start seeing Omega Metroids, which seem like larger Zeta Metroids that are just as much of a pain and will take more missiles to destroy. None of the Metroid fights are all that dynamic and get quite repetitive, especially in the latter part of the game where the areas become smaller and less oriented towards exploration, opting instead to send you down direct paths to fight something. In fact, that leads to one of Metroid 2's biggest faults, the lack of interesting boss fights. There's a small mid-boss fight with a creature called Arachnus in the room where you get the Spring Ball, but otherwise you're just doing the same Metroid fights multiple times over and over. Finally, when you reach the Queen Metroid, you get an actual boss encounter where you can either dodge the attacks and plug away at its health with 150 missiles, or you can take the more direct and certainly more interesting route of stunning her and rolling into the mouth down to the stomach and laying bombs, which are significantly more effective than trying to chip away at the fight with missiles. Do this 5 times, and that's it. Your health is restored, and the path behind clears while a light melodic tune plays you out. I actually wonder if the stomach route is the intended way to go about fighting the Queen, but I've tried the missile route and it's just too much of a pain. Perhaps that's the idea, to force you to find other methods. It's not really telegraphed at all, which has me kind of wondering. Unlike Metroid, where you're faced with a daring escape, Metroid 2 takes a more contemplative, conciliatory tone. There's no more enemies to fight as you come across the egg you passed under earlier. Out from it hatches a baby Metroid. The last Metroid at that, and it imprints on Samus and follows her as she works her way out of the caves. It even clears the path so you can make your way back to the surface. Finally, clearing the big wall with your space jump plants you back where you started at your ship, and Samus departs SR-388 with the baby Metroid as the credits roll along. Again, there are time-based multiple endings, with the sub 3 hour mark displaying Samus in the swimsuit. Now, back on that contemplative tone I just mentioned. Metroid 2 ends on a quieter note than its bombastic predecessor, and it gives you a few moments to really reflect on the last few hours you spent playing it. It goes without saying that Metroid 2 Return of Samus is a darker game than the original, and not just because it requires a proper light source to see what you're doing. Metroid struck a very adventurous tone with its atmosphere and its mission, where you're setting off to the planet Zebes to take down the space pirates. It's the classic good versus evil story where the lines are easily drawn. Metroid 2, by comparison, is different. Like, okay, I know it's a video game, and that I glossed over this at the beginning, but you just spent the last few hours wiping an entire species off the planet, just because you were tasked by the Galactic Federation to do so. And in that final contemplative escape with the Metroid hatchling, it's the first real inkling we get of Samus pushing against that, recognizing the implication of her actions and expressing a desire to move beyond them. For a game so devoid of exposition within the confines of the cartridge, Samus shows a lot of character growth with very little, and the events of this game would have huge ramifications on the rest of the series moving forward, all because she decided to let the Metroid hatchling live. Video games, by and large, task the player with killing something to progress. It's been our primary source of user input in the medium since, well, almost the beginning. And as time progresses, this input becomes more complicated, more detailed, more visceral, as we become desensitized to the increasing levels of violence in the video games we play. In Metroid 2 Return of Samus, as you progress further, the music gets a little more sparse. Life forms become less common, as if the Metroids that have grown larger and more powerful have wiped out everything that lives down there. Or maybe you're just traversing spaces that have long been untouched by most living creatures. You're more directly forced to come to grips with the genocidal nature of your mission, and by extension the game itself. Sure, it's a Game Boy game from 1991, and it probably isn't that deep, but it's something to think about. Even the overall structure of the game lends itself to this notion of quiet contemplation, intensified by the continuous descent into the depths of SR-388 as you stray further and further from the implied safety of the surface. Traveling deeper and deeper down removes that crutch, and more we are just left with a sense of isolation and the potential for dread. Is that too obvious? Should I keep that? A game like Super Mario 64 presents the player with several instances where your main goal is to get to the top or the high point of some space, usually to fight a boss, but it's often the first goal you are tasked with within a level, reaching that highest point where you can triumphantly see all the way down, or at least as far as the render distance and hardware will allow. A lot of games are built like this, where you're trying to reach the top, or you're trying to reach point B from point A, where upon reaching the goal, point B feels like a safe haven, a triumphant spot of power, shielding you from the dangerous world below. And while Metroid 2 sends you on a genocidal road movie from location to location, the fabled point B is far below the point A that other games would consider the dangerous beginning. Additionally, where Metroid felt like an adventure, Metroid 2 is more like a straightforward mission. And when you finally reach the Metroid Queen, you kind of have to grapple with the idea that, like everything else on the planet you've faced thus far, it's just trying to protect its space and what's left of its brood that you have spent the last several hours slaughtering. It's a lot to think about for a dinky little handheld game from 1991, right? I probably wouldn't make such a big deal about it if it didn't have such large implications for where the series would go. Unlike a lot of video game sequels at the time, Metroid 2 was an actual direct follow-up to the events of the previous game, and the Metroid series set out early to create a consistent narrative, even if it lingered in the background or was confined to an exposition dump in an instruction manual. The point is that it was there, and now we await Metroid Dread to provide us an update on that story, 19 years after the last mainline entry in the series. So, something I didn't really touch on while talking about the previous game was my own personal history with it. Truthfully, I didn't play the original Metroid until I unlocked it on my copy of Metroid Zero Mission on Game Boy Advance. I grew up playing Super Metroid, and when I got my clear Play It Loud series Game Boy in the mid-90s, Metroid 2 was one of the few games I had that I really dedicated a lot of time to. I don't think I ever beat it, but I was at least familiar with it, and it stuck with me. Partially because of my attachment to Super Metroid, of course, but mostly because of the very distinct atmosphere it provided in contrast to its bigger, better sequel. And yeah, maybe a little because it was a Metroid game I could take with me in my bag or play in the car during road trips. Metroid 2: Return of Samus is far from perfect, and it will always be overshadowed by the games that bookend it. But it's tremendously important, both for the genre and for the series. I personally really dislike how the space jump handles in this game in particular, and little things here and there make it feel clunkier than the NES game. Plus, I just wish the soundtrack was better, or I at least wish there was more to it. Nevertheless, it introduced a lot of items and ideas that would be expanded upon in subsequent games, and I still think it has a lot to offer. The word I would use to describe it overall is transitory, and I expect, unfortunately, that the remake will become the de facto method going forward to experience Metroid 2, if it ever leaves the 3DS that is. The NES game, by comparison, is still far more playable in 2021, and is somehow less obtuse in its intent by virtue of its level design, even if it is less directly linear. I like Metroid 2, but it has so many problems that make it hard to go back to. So, Metroid 2: Return of Samus. What a game, huh? This little sequel released 5 years after the 1986 original, continuing the same story and setting up what was to come in the far-off future of 1994, which we'll talk about next time on the third installment of METROSPECTIVE. I mean, the last Metroid is in captivity, so the galaxy is at peace, right?